This episode of Where Did the Road Go is brought to you in part by our Patreons. If you want to become a patron, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Soraya.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? Tonight is the first of a two-part interview. I didn't actually realize this was going to be a two-part interview, but I had a really interesting guest, and it went way longer, and we probably could have gone into a third part if we really wanted to, but I'll just have him back at some future point. My guest tonight is Robert Guffey, and he has written a book called Chameleo, a strange but true story of invisible spies, heroin addiction, and homeland security. And this has a lot of implications across the board in paranormal fields, especially in modern ufology, because it deals with some of the secret technology that seems to actually exist in the military that could explain some unusual encounters. Now, in saying that, I don't mean that there are not actual anomalous UFOs, but it's more to the point that it becomes very hard to tell what's anomalous and what's not. And this book is a great example of that. I'll tell you, I loved reading this book. It's really good. It is not currently available on Amazon, and we talk about this at the end. Apparently, there are copies on Amazon going for $1,000 or something ridiculous like that. You can get it from Or Books, ORBOOKS.com for like under $20. And there's an ebook as well. It will eventually be available on Amazon officially, but for the moment it is not, and people are taking advantage of that and trying to, sell it for ridiculous amounts. But yeah, this is there's the second part of this is already recorded, so Patreons will get that pretty quickly. And there's a little extra segment we did too, which was just part of our conversation afterwards, and I realized it would make a good Patreon segment, so I'm going to put that up as well. But yeah, this is a story about his friend who got mixed up with the wrong people and suffered some pretty bizarre harassment by some element of the government. That's, I guess, the best way to explain it. It's a very strange story, and we get into a lot of different parts and how those parts intersect with other things. So I hope you enjoy it. Here's my conversation, part one of my conversation with Robert Guffey. All right, Robert, welcome to the show, finally.
Thank you for having me on.
And your book is Chameleo, a strange but true story of invisible spies, heroin addiction, and homeland security. And when did this come out?
The book was published in 2015. So it's a couple years old at this point.
Okay. And this is nonfiction.
Absolutely nonfiction, though there are people who will try to tell you otherwise.
Yeah, and that well, you're a fiction writer. This is the thing. Like, I'm looking at your bio, and you're a fiction writer, and you're into conspiracy culture.
Yes, that's true. I've the book I just published this past November is called Until the Last Dog Dies, which is fiction, which is about a humor virus. It's a virus, a pandemic virus that affects the entire world. That it affects only the humor centers of the brain. It doesn't kill you, but it takes your sense of humor away.
Oh man!
And it's told from the point of view of a stand-up comedian in L.A. And eventually he comes down with the virus, and it starts affecting him as well. So it has this speculative science fictional element at the core of it, but it kind of also emerges out of the Chameleo experiences as well, at least at a metaphorical level, about taking someone's imagination away, their sense of humor, their spirit, their soul away, and that's where the idea came from for Until Last Dog Dies. But I think if you read that, which is a novel, and compare it to the way Chameleo is written, I think that a reasonable person could tell that they're written very differently, and that the way I write fiction is different from the way that I wrote Chameleo. Or my first book, Cryptoeschatology, that's also nonfiction and is very much different from my second book, which is called Spies and Saucers, which is a collection of novellas that all take place in the 1950s amidst the contactee culture at that time period. So I have 2 books of nonfiction, 2 of fiction, and I think that they're written in very different styles. The approach is different. The stuff in Chameleo, I don't think that anyone could come up with it. It's so peculiar that, and in fact, that's one reason why I included long transcripts, conversations between me and my friend, who I called Dion in the book, but his real name is Damien. I include long conversations with him and also a very long interview with Richard Schoengert, a scientist, because I think you can read that and see that this is not dialogue that anyone would make up if you were writing a stage play or a screenplay. I tried to edit it down as little as possible, so that you could that authenticity would be obvious to the reader.
And I will say this is actually a very hard book to put down. It kind of shows that you have that fictional writing ability, because there's a lot of books I'll read on this type of stuff that are very dry. And they're good books, but they, I could stop at the end of any chapter and be like, okay, I'll read the rest of that tomorrow. With this one, I'm going, I'll just read one more chapter. I'm like, it's like reading a fiction book. Like I want to see what comes next.
Well, that's a huge compliment, because one of the main things I wanted to do to accomplish with the book was to make it entertaining, because so often books that are about conspiratorial subjects such as this, it can sort of seem like the eccentric guy on the park bench with the bullhorn yelling at you about the coming New World Order, and it's easy to just walk right on past that guy. And so people don't like being preached at. They don't like being lectured at either. So my intent was, I'm going to tell this like a story. And the thing is, I spent many years trying not to think about any of this. Because, of course, it all began in 2003 and spilled over into 2004 and even past that. I think we interviewed Richard Schoengert, which we'll get to later, in 2006. So theoretically, I could have written the book back in 2006 or 2007, but I was really just trying not to think about it. And I really didn't know how to approach the story anyway, because it seemed so complicated and bizarre. I didn't even really know where to begin. But I mentioned at the end of the book that I was teaching a literature of science fiction class at CSU Long Beach, and it just so happened that after class one day, a student came up to me and said, "Can you think of an idea, a science fictional idea that people think of as science fiction, but it really isn't?" And immediately I thought of invisibility, which plays a role in this story. And I began telling him the story just extemporaneously. And I stood there in the hallway telling him the story. It took about 40 minutes or something, and his jaw was hanging. And he said, "Professor, please, our next class period, tell that story again to the entire class." I said, "Okay." And so the next class period, he asked me to tell the story, and I did. And oddly enough, it just so happened that there was a student in my class who was part of the ROTC. He would come to class every day in full military uniform. He was always very polite. He'd call me sir at the beginning of each sentence. And everyone in the class, I told them the story, and everyone in the class was just sitting there thinking, they looked like they had blank stares on their faces. And then this guy in the ROTC, he raises his hand and he says, "Sir, everything that you've just said overlaps with things that I've heard in my training. I can't say exactly what that is, of course, because we were sworn to secrecy. But the things that you said correlate very precisely with what I heard." And then everyone sort of became less skeptical at that point. But right after that class period, I left the classroom and I crouched down the hallway and I pulled a notebook out of my bag and bullet points, wrote down everything I had said in the order I said it in as a kind of outline. And it took up like two full sides of 2 pages. And that became the outline for the book. Somehow talking it out made me realize, oh, that's how to tell the story. Just take it from the top chronologically and barrel right through it. And fortunately, I had a lot of notes from that time period. I just, that's the kind of person I am. I take a lot of notes. So I had a lot of notes. I had tape recordings of me talking to Damien, talking to Richard Schoengert, me telling the story to other people on the phone. I'd gone out of my way to record some of my own telephone conversations just to have all the facts down, because of course as time goes on you forget certain things, and I'm very glad I did that because I had that stuff to draw upon in order to write the book.
Nice. How did you and you actually did write a fictional version of this story too that you tried to get published?
Oh yes, in fact it's kind of interesting. I haven't looked at that in a long time, but it probably would be interesting to read it now after having written Chameleo, because that book, that novel, was written in I think 2006, right before it was 2005, beginning of 2006, right before I met Richard Schoengert, who is the figure who confirms everything that Damien had been telling me up to that point. And so, since it was written before I met Richard, there was still a kind of doubt in my mind whether or not was this all real, or
Yeah.
was this a product of hallucination, or you don't really want to believe that this could be happening. And so I tried to go out of my way to believe that it wasn't, that there was a slight possibility that it wasn't true, and so I actually wrote that novel right before meeting Richard. If you read that book, which is not published, and I haven't even really looked at it in a long time, it's written in such a way where what's happening to the characters themselves are not sure if this is really happening or not. So they would be kind of interesting as an artifact to read that, because that's kind of like where my head was at before I sat down with Damien and spoke to Richard at great length about his technology, which was stolen and used against my friend Damien.
How did you get interested in conspiracy culture to begin with?
That's interesting, because I suspect that a lot of people who are targeted, a lot of them have a problem with even maintaining relationships with the people they used to know before all this began, because family members abandoned them, spouses abandoned them, children, friends, because they think that they've gone crazy, they've gone nuts.
Sure.
In this particular instance, the reason I was able to write the book is because I already had somewhat of a background in this kind of material, because I was friends with Walter Boart. Walter Boart wrote the book Operation Mind Control, which was published in '77. That was the first book about the mind control operations at MK Ultra. That was the first book that really went into detail about how invasive these experiments had been, and not only that, Walter went out of his way to point out that these weren't just experiments. Hence the title of the book, Operation Mind Control. It was operational. It wasn't just experiments. So we tested LSD on some of our own people, and it got out of control, and Frank Olson jumped out of a window and accidentally killed himself. It went beyond that to say, no, this is operational. It was operational in Vietnam. In fact, that's how Walter started investigating it himself. He had a cousin who had gone to Vietnam, and he came back with what Walter described as, quote, cardboard memories, unquote, meaning that they had taken his cousin and they had taken out his memories, turned him into a programmed assassin, just like the Manchurian Candidate. He'd killed a bunch of people, a remote control killer, and then sent them back home. And the only way to put his memories back in were by showing him photographs of what his childhood had been like. But there was no sensory details connected to those images. So hence Walter Boart described it as cardboard memories. He could see still images in his mind of what he looked like as a child or what the house looked like that he grew up in. But he couldn't remember anything beyond that. So he was really like a brain-dead case. And Walter was so haunted by this that he began investigating it, discovering it had happened to many, many other people. And out of that grew Operation Mind Control. And then I met Walter in the late 90s and read his book. And so I was very familiar with mind control and that whole milieu. And I had read The Control of Candy Jones, and which Candy Jones claimed that she was also a hypnoprogrammed agent for the U.S. military, and also books like The Transformation of America by Kathy O'Brien, which oddly enough I remember sharing with Damien, and Damien critiquing it, thinking it was a little too way out there. like Damien, I remember Damien saying, "This reads like porn for right wingers." Like it was so detailed in Kathy O'Brien's alleged sexual encounters with Hillary Clinton, et cetera, that he said it reads like pornography for right wingers. That right wingers can read this and be disgusted at it and get turned on at the same time. That was Damien's critique of it, which, there might be some validity to that. But so he was actually quite skeptical of any conspiracy theory that was like a little too outlandish. In retrospect, if you go back and read Kathy O'Brien's book, it's like, well, a lot of the things that seemed outlandish actually turned out to be true later on. So I don't know. And so maybe we can get into that a little bit later. So it's kind of ironic that Damien was a little bit skeptical about certain conspiracy theories and then ended up being in the middle of one. But as a result of my background with Walter Boart, I was kind of willing to accept the initial premise of what he was telling me. Even though I knew about mind control, I was not at all familiar with this whole gang stalking phenomenon. That was something that was totally new to me. I'd never heard anything about that.
Well, let's start at the beginning with Damien and how that all started out with. And you've known him since high school.
Yes. We met on my 16th birthday.
Oh, and he does have a bit of a problem with drugs, it seems.
Yes. That's definitely. And again, that's another reason why someone like Damien wouldn't be believed, because if you're a drug addict, immediately you would just assume, oh, well, they're just hallucinating. Right. People who aren't experienced with drugs tend to think that all drugs are exactly the same. So, Damien was a heroin addict. That was his main thing, which generally doesn't cause wildish psychoactive hallucinations, So in Damien's case, he was living in Pacific Beach area of San Diego around this time, 2003. It was the summer of 2003. And his house was kind of a party house, people coming in and out all the time. And he, through a friend, met this kid who needed a place to stay. And so Damien was like, what the hell? Sure, you can crash on my couch or whatever. And the guy's name was Lee, or at least that's what he said his name was. And one night, Damien's having this party. There's people doing all sorts of drugs. And Lee pulls out this laptop computer and turns it on, and a DOD symbol flashes on the screen. And at that moment, Damien said, okay, wait a minute. Hold on here. Pack up your stuff and just get the hell out. Because he immediately recognized that this was stolen property, which in fact it was. It turned out that Lee had gone AWOL from Camp Pendleton and had taken with him a DOD laptop computer, a 9mm Iraqi gun that was taken off the body of a dead Iraqi general, 23 pairs of high-tech night vision goggles, and apparently an entire truck. And some people will criticize the story and say that's impossible. There's no way that a kid could have gone AWOL from Camp Pendleton and taken all that stuff. I don't know what to tell you, man. That's what he did, and he took all that stuff. Not only, but also if you go back on YouTube, just punch in like tank and San Diego, you'll see that about a few years before all this, a guy living in the same exact area that Damien was living in, Pacific Beach, went, quote, crazy, unquote, stole a tank from an armory and drove it right down the middle of San Diego and ended up getting stuck on the freeway. The cops broke through the top of the tank and just shot him
Right.
where he was sitting, and apparently the guy wanted to go to City Hall to make a statement about something. And as I say in the book, I suspect that he also was being tortured with this technology. So that guy managed to steal a whole tank, so I'm not that skeptical that the guy could steal night vision goggles.
Right.
So he turns on the laptop computer, the DoD symbol flashes on, Damien tells him to get the hell out. The kid says, "Oh, don't worry about this. They can't track this stuff."
Right.
Then within minutes, there's a knock at the door. Damien opens it, and there's a woman standing there. She identifies herself, a special agent, Lita Johnson of the NCIS. That's a made-up name. I have her real name and contact information. She's there with two other goons, and they say they want to search the apartment. And Damien grew up in the house of a narcotics cop, which is ironic since he later became a heroin addict. But so he was very familiar with his rights as a U.S. citizen. And he said, "Well, do you have a warrant?" She said, "No, but I can come back with one very quickly." He said, "Well, come back when you have a warrant." And he slams the door in her face, tells everyone who's busy doing drugs right there in front of him, pick up your stuff and go out the back door. And they all immediately throw their stuff onto the floor and go out the back door.
Of course.
When they saw that that there was heat in the area. Within minutes, or a very short period of time, the NCIS comes back, as does the San Diego Police Department. They show up too on the scene, though according to Damien, it seemed like they weren't working together. They were really like bumping into each other, Keystone Cop style. Didn't seem to be working with each other. And even though there's drugs all over the place, they didn't seem to care about that at all. What this particular NCIS agent wanted were these night vision goggles. That was of the utmost importance. And they arrest this kid Lee, and they arrest Damien. They take both of them down to the San Diego jail and proceed to give Damien the Abu Ghraib treatment for about a week. Damien, they tell him that this kid Lee, that his name is not Lee, that his name is Doyle. They think that Damien is somehow involved in the sale of this military equipment, as if Damien and this kid were in league with each other to sell this equipment to like Al Qaeda. And Damien's trying to tell him, "I don't even know the guy. I didn't know his name was Doyle, and he was just sleeping on my couch." But they couldn't accept that. I mean, there's huge Kafkaesque qualities to this story. And Damien's trying to convince him, no, he's just, a friend of a friend. I don't know anything about this. They wanted him to cooperate, and Damien's not the most cooperative person on the planet in the first place.
Right.
So I could see how that probably went south very quickly. He's been in and out of prison his entire life, and it's ingrained in him not to snitch. That's the worst possible thing you can do. So there was nothing he was going to say. Even if he did know anything about it, he wouldn't have cooperated. So they eventually, though, after about a week, they let Damien go. Now, around this time, I was trying to call him. When the day that he was arrested, I had tried to call him, and no one answered the phone. I left a message, and he didn't call back the next day or the next day. And after a few days, I began to wonder what had happened, because he usually called me back. And so after 7 days, he finally calls back, and he tells me this insane story that he'd been arrested and all of this. We both assume that that's the end of the story. They realized Damien didn't have anything to do with it, and they just let him go, and that's the end of it. A couple of days later, he calls me back to tell me that there are just hordes of jarheads, military-looking dudes, following him around the city. And in the way he described it at first was that there was like a dozen of these guys following him around and being very obvious about it. A parade of people who would follow him into 7-Eleven, then follow him out again. He'd go to the Mexican restaurant down the street. They would sit at all the tables around him and stare at him. And then he'd go home, and they'd park in the parking lot outside the apartment building and just shine their headlights through his window. Or they'd blare the car radio at 3:30 a.m. right outside his apartment. And it started with really sort of, quote, mundane, unquote, harassment like that. When he first started telling me about it, I wondered myself, is this some sort of meth-induced paranoia?
Right.
Which is certainly, it's possible. People who take meth have paranoia, and they think that people are following them. And so I wondered if maybe, even though he had never exhibited any signs like that before this moment, who knows, maybe this is the breaking point. So I asked him, I said, why don't you take photographs of the people who are following you? And you say there are these cars following you around. They're parked outside your apartment. Take photographs and send them to me. So he did that. And I wrote all the license plate numbers down and sent the list to a friend of mine up in Seattle who worked for the DMV. He ran all the numbers through the system, and all of them came back as non-existent, which didn't make any sense to me because I knew they existed.
Right.
And if Damien was being paranoid, they would come up as real vehicles, people living in San Diego.
Sure, yeah.
But they didn't come up at all. They were officially non-existent, and the only way that could be is if they were government vehicles. So that was like the first indication, and that list of license plate numbers is in the book. That was the first indication to me that, okay, no, he's not being paranoid. Then, as the thing progresses, he starts telling me about how the harassment is getting worse and worse. And what would happen is this would be a continuous thing. And this woman, this NCIS woman, Lita Johnson, all the people who are parked outside his house and harassing him, they would suddenly pull away, and then Lita Johnson comes up, goes up to the door, knocks on the door, and says, have you changed your mind? Are you willing to cooperate now and tell us where these night vision goggles are? And Damien would say, I can't do that because I don't know where they are. And then she would say, well, if you change your mind, call my number. And she gives him her card. She and her two goons get back in the car and drive away. Then all the cars come back, and they start turning on the car radio again, shining the lights through the window, and all the harassment starts up all over again. And it was very complicated. This was what they call, at the time, the term gang stalking didn't even exist in 2003. People were calling it, quote, street theater, because of the way that it's almost a performance. Two people will be walking behind you, talking about you, saying private details about your life as if you're not there. Then you'll get on the bus, and there's two people on the bus, and they continue the conversation or repeat the words that you heard an hour before. And so he's telling me all this. By the way, I should point out that in this area in Pacific Beach, his apartment is right next to a corporation. At that time, it's since moved. But at that time, there was a corporation called Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC, that was within pretty much walking distance of his apartment on Garnett Avenue. There was another corporation called ATC, American Technology Corporation, and both of these corporations specialize in creating exotic weaponry, noise cancellation weaponry, quote, non-lethal weapons. So Damien, the harassment gets more and more bizarre to the point where he'll be lying in bed, and a silhouette of a hand holding a gun would appear on the wall above his head and then tilt downward so that the silhouette of the gun was pointing at his head. He saw this amorphous mass of black energy crawl across the carpet, crawled into his leather jacket that was laying on the carpet, and then the leather jacket started moving. Oddly enough, I've spoken to a lot of people who were supposedly alien abductees who've reported similar phenomenon, that crawling black energy thing. Then he tells me that there's people in the house who he cannot see, who are interacting with him, pushing him over, talking to him. This again sounds like classic schizophrenia.
Right.
At one point he opened the bathroom mirror and the medicine cabinet, and as the mirror was in motion, he could see briefly the outline of a person behind him, a little person. And occasionally the technology would break down, and he would see an outline of a very small person kind of like auras, like that some people who suffer from migraine headaches report seeing these like auras in the air, and that's kind of like what they look like, but like the outline of a small person, dots in the air, and then Lita Johnson would call again. Now, have you changed your mind? Yeah. Oh no, you haven't changed your mind yet. And then it'd start all over again. So I actually at one point I asked Damien. I said, why don't you give me her phone number? Because she'd given it to him. She said, call me. When you change your mind. So I said, give me the phone number. Half because I just wanted to make sure that she was real.
Right. Yeah.
And so I called her. She answered the phone. She identified herself. I told her who I was. She seemed really put off that I was calling her and asking. She seemed really surprised that anyone was calling her to talk about this. And I said, well, my friend claims that he's being followed. And I got a series of CYA answers, like listening to Hillary Clinton speak. Just a lot of like legalese, sort of going out of your way, verbal acrobatics to avoid actually answering the question. So, for example, when I said, is my friend being followed? She goes, no one in my agency is currently following your friend. Which I'm sure that's a true statement.
Right.
And then she would say, I said, well, then is it okay for Damien to leave town? Because I don't want him to do anything illegal. And then she said, I wouldn't advise that. And I go, well, if you're not interested in him and there's no case against him, why would you advise that he not leave town? She goes, well, it just might make things difficult later on. And she was very annoyed that I called. She implied that Damien was crazy. Conversation didn't end well. The whole transcript of that conversation is also in the book.
Right.
Then there was the case of the food fight, where Damien was in his kitchen making lunch. And there's two jarheads right outside his window talking to each other about Damien. So Damien starts putting in like spaghetti and pasta, and then he just starts throwing in like baking soda and Jell-O and peanut butter, and he's mixing it all together, pudding. He mixes it all together in this weird sticky goo, and then runs outside and throws the pot of goo over the fence, and it hits both of these jarhead guys on the head, and they're covered in this weird goo, and they just go running off into the parking lot of like the Vons that was next door, which is later on actually led to the only moment where Lita Johnson actually admitted that they were watching him, because Damien got it into his head that it would be a really good idea to contact Lita and ask her if they could meet for lunch, because he wanted to he said to me, oh, well, I'm going to offer my services that I can maybe help track down the goggles, and then they'll stop harassing me. And I said, that's insane. They're just going to think that you've had them all along, and you've been holding out on them this whole time. No. This will be good. It'll show them like my good faith, And so he does meet with them, and that meeting didn't go well at all. Lita Johnson was there at a bagel shop on Garnett Avenue with her superior. So that's how you showed you how serious they took this. Mm-hmm. And Damien at one point just said, "Listen, I just want to stop having food fights with the feds. I don't want that to happen anymore." And Lita Johnson smiles in spite of herself and said, "Yes, that made us all laugh." That was the only time where the curtain was pulled aside. And she actually admitted that he was being stalked, harassed, and surveilled.
Yeah.
There's also an interesting aspect to that conversation in that there's a kind of Candide-like quality to Damien, where sometimes he's not aware. There's a kind of oddly innocent quality about him, even though he's been in and out of jail. and so there's a kind of sometimes a bit of an unawareness. And so there's one point where Lita Johnson is telling him how great an area Pacific Beach was when she was a little girl, and that it really needs to be cleaned up. and the scumbags we need to do something about all these scumbags, in San Diego, in our town. And Damien's not getting that she's talking about him. And he's agreeing with her. He's like, oh, yeah, I know what you mean. They annoy me so much. And I can just imagine her blood pressure rising as he's not getting that she's insulting him.
Right.
And so that conversation didn't go well at all. In fact, it ended with her superior just turning red and yelling at Damien for not thanking him for buying him the orange juice and the bagel, which I guess was, that was a work expense for that day.
Yeah.
So eventually it got so bad that this extended from summer of 2003 all the way into about January, February 2004. By the beginning of 2004, Damien's lost weight. He's urinating blood. He has a metallic taste in his mouth, which I knew from Walter Board that was a sign of electromagnetic radiation poisoning. So around this time, Damien runs into this beachcomber who is selling a van for like $700 or $500, something like that. I can't remember. Damien said that he wanted to buy it, but that someone stole his wallet, and all his money was gone. And so I, without even telling him, decide to wire him some money so that he can buy the van and get out. Because I naively thought that if he just left town, it would all stop.
Right.
Which a lot of people think that. And so I don't know if you've ever sent someone money through Western Union, but you have to give a password.
Right.
That the other person, the receiver, will give to the clerk, and then that proves that they're the one who is supposed to receive the money. So the password I made up is pornographic in nature, so I can't say what it is. But I knew that it was sort of an in-joke between me and Damien.
Right.
So I call Damien to give him the password and tell him I just wired him this money. So I do that, and Damien's surprised and grateful. And I say, well, let me give you the password. He goes, no, don't give him the password right now, because he's concerned that if I say it over the phone, because obviously they're listening to the phone calls, that someone will go and take the money in his place before he can get there. So he goes, let me pack everything up first, and then in a couple of hours I'll call you back and you give me the password. Okay. So 2 hours later he calls back, and I say, okay, the password is the phone goes dead. I call him back. The password is the phone goes dead. That happened 6, 7, 8 times, And then suddenly I realized something that was unique for when you're placing a collect phone call. If you've ever placed a collect phone call to someone, there's a moment where the operator is talking to the other person saying, will you accept the phone call?
Right.
Where you can both hear each other. And so I placed a collect phone call to Damien. He picked up the phone, and while she was saying, will you accept the charges, I yelled out a hint as to what the password was.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard Damien laugh for half a second, so I knew he understood it, and then the phone went dead. So he was able to go over to the Western Union and pick up the money and get the van, and he packed everything into the van, and he takes off. Now, keep in mind, it's 2004. No one's talking about drones. There's no one's shooting drones out of the sky over Dodger Stadium.
Before we get to him leaving, let's go over some of the things, a couple of other things that I noticed when he was there. First of all, he did, the people in his apartment he called invisible midgets.
Yes, that was the charming phrase that he came up with, was invisible midgets, and that became a kind of humorous running joke the entire time. We would talk about the invisible midgets who were following him.
And you made a good point, though, that if you're trying to keep someone invisible, having someone who's small and agile and stuff and can get in and out of things easier would make more sense than a bigger person.
Well, as we discover later on, since we know that this technology is actually being used by the military, yes, if you want to get in and out of tight spaces really quick, this technology does not make you bulletproof. Right.
Yeah.
So it's good to have someone who's agile, who's small, who could get in and out of tight places really fast. And so it actually makes perfect sense that you would hire very small, athletic, agile people to wear this technology.
Yeah. There was also a thing about his apartment feeling bigger or smaller, and other people noticed this as well.
Oh yes, the fake space phenomenon. The Damien would come home, and he would notice that the apartment seemed to get bigger. He calls me one day. He says, "My apartment's growing." If you've ever seen Doctor Who, you'll know that Doctor Who has a TARDIS, which is a spacecraft that's also a time machine. And when you go inside the TARDIS, it's much bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. Exactly
Right.
the same principle. And he would go inside, and the room was either smaller or bigger. And it wasn't just him who would notice this. His friends would come over and say, "Is the room getting bigger?" Later on, we'll discover that in fact, the optical camouflage technology can, in fact, make that happen. Also, noise cancellation. I mentioned before that ATC, American Technology Corporation, which was based in that same area, was specializing in stuff like noise cancellation technology. One time I was on the phone with Damien, and as I was talking to him, when you're talking on the phone with someone, there's some ambient noise you can hear in the background, like cars going by, or the TV in the background, the radio is on, whatever. All that just stopped all of a sudden. And then Damien says, all the noise is gone. And then very often things would happen that if you didn't know any better, you would think the house is haunted, or that there were poltergeists in the house. Things start flying around the room. And as I said, Damien's been in and out of jail. He's been homeless in D.C. He shared a prison. He was on the same cell block as Mike Tyson. So he's been around the block. Okay, he's not easily scared. He was crouched on the floor. He sounded like an 8-year-old girl as these things were flying around the room and tchotchkes shattering on the shelf. And I heard that myself. I was on the phone with him when that happened, and he was scared essless. So there was a whole panoply of odd phenomenon that was going on.
Yeah, the other interesting one was his window one of his windows looked like it was a window to somewhere else, almost like a portal.
Yeah, he opened the curtains and he looked out the window, and instead of seeing the scene that he'd always seen, suddenly it was this sort of surreal science fictional landscape, like three moons in the sky. It looked like a Boris Vallejo painting. But then he opened the door, and it just looked like the normal scene that he would always see. Again, this is also something that's possible with optical camouflage technology.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that one doesn't seem that hard to believe.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things, how did he relate this stuff to you? Did you take notes while you were talking to him?
Yes, I took voluminous notes, and again, I recorded a lot of the conversations. And at the time, I was in contact with Joan D'Arc, who was the editor of Paranoia magazine, and I had written a lot of articles for Paranoia magazine, mostly involving mind control, again, because of the connection with Walter. I wrote an article called Honey, Did You Leave Your Brain Back at Langley Again?, which appeared in Paranoia in like 97. And that is, in fact, in my first book, Crypto Scatology. And Joan, I called Joan to tell her the whole story, and I didn't have the technology actually to record both ends of the phone conversation, so I just recorded me talking to her.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so glad I did that, because I kept that recording. And so later on, when I decided that I should write a book about this, I went back to that recording, and a lot of the details that I otherwise may have forgotten, like specific dates, specific times, specific names, little details like that, were there on the recording, which I made simultaneous with it happening. So yes, I tried to document it in many ways, and in fact, Damien was documenting it the entire time too. He was photographing a lot of things, and a couple of those photographs appear at the beginning of the book. Unfortunately, I was just speaking to Damien the other day on the phone, and I've known other people who have described when something takes over their body and makes them do something that they don't want to do.
Mm-hmm.
I have two friends who claim to be abductees and my lab experiencers, and they've had experiences where they were driving down the street, and this one particular woman I know, her foot just started going on the gas, going through a red light, and she didn't want to do that. Huh. And I know another friend who you may know of, Melinda Leslie. She had an experience where she woke up, she was getting ready in the morning, she grabbed her hairdryer, turned on the faucet, and plugged it into the wall and held the hairdryer under the running faucet. And she didn't want to be doing this. Obviously, you don't want to do that. And so these things have happened to other people. Recently, Damien had an experience where he had a glass of milk, and he took it and poured it into the back of his computer. And he said that it's the strangest thing, where your hand is doing something and your mind is telling you not to do it, but your hand's doing it anyway. And it destroyed everything in the computer that he had, everything that he'd been photographing since 2003. So the harassment is in fact ongoing.
So do those pictures not exist anywhere else?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
Some of them I have some of them, but very small amount.
Now, initially, they seemed to be referring to you as Mr. Big, but wouldn't it have been pretty easy for them to figure out who you were?
No, well, that's not a direct quote. That was sort of me imagining what they're thinking, because they think that Damien's trying to sell this stuff, but the only person he's talking to is me. So I was like, so that I meant that somewhat sarcastically, because obviously I'm not Mr. Big, and Damien's not talking to anyone else. So who else is it that he's supposedly selling this equipment to? He's obviously not in contact with, foreign-sounding gentlemen in the Middle East. So who is it that they think he's selling this stuff to? I really think that at a certain point it began with the night vision goggles and then wanting to get those goggles back. But I think eventually what it became was, and it can be as simple as this, that Damien just pissed somebody off.
Yeah.
During that week's time, when he was in the jail and he was interacting with them, and I can easily see this happening, of him pissing them off because he wasn't cooperating. And I already quoted Lita Johnson talking about how she wanted to, quote, clean up the neighborhood,
right,
in Pacific Beach. And they just decided, this is a perfect guy. First of all, he's not cooperating, so we think he's an SOB. B, he's a drug addict and a degenerate. And C, we need someone to test this stuff out on. I remember talking to someone at the time, and she said, she was a fellow professor at CSU Long Beach. She said to me, if they had equipment like this and they wanted to test it out, why can't they just test it out on Camp Pendleton? Why would they have to pick a civilian to test it out on? And I immediately said, well, because you need to test this out in an environment that is unpredictable.
Yeah.
On someone who doesn't expect any of this, so you can see where the weaknesses are, because you want to be able to pinpoint the weaknesses of this technology before you utilize it in a real life battle situation. Better for Damien to notice you in the bathroom mirror than for some guy, for the enemy with a gun, to notice you in the bathroom mirror.
Yeah, definitely. And the U.S. has a history of doing things like that anyway. I mean, it's not unheard of.
Oh, certainly not. No, and Walter does an excellent job of documenting all that in Operation Mind Control.
Yeah. There was also some, you talk about sonic weapons that were probably being used on him as well.
Yeah, well, what John Alexander likes to call non-lethal weapons.
Mm-hmm.
SAIC, which is based in Pacific Beach. In fact, it was located right across the street from the Whaley House, WHALEY, Whaley House, which is notorious amongst paranormal investigators for being the most haunted place in California.
Yep.
It's in the Old Town district of San Diego, and SAIC at that point was located just right across the street, which I find interesting. I'm not suggesting that SAIC was creating paranormal phenomenon back in 1899 when supposedly hauntings started. But it is interesting. One wonders if these people don't pick certain geographical locations because perhaps they're a nexus for this kind of odd phenomenon. When I was on Coast to Coast with George Knapp, I mentioned, because I read The Hunt for the Skinwalker, George Knapp's book about the ranch that
in Utah,
Bigelow was doing. And there were a lot of parallels between his book and Chameleo. If you read them back to back, you'll see the parallels. And I suggested to him that it makes perfect sense that if you're going to experiment with technology like this, why not pick an area that already has a reputation for being, quote, haunted, unquote.
Yeah.
So if something odd happens or someone sees something odd, you just say, oh, that's the Skinwalker Ranch. It's been haunted for 100 years. Oh, that's the Whaley House. Yeah, everyone knows that place is weird. So in other words, there can be two things going on at the same time. So SAIC was located in that location at that time, not far from where Damien was living. It has since moved, and SAIC has split into two different corporations, one called Leidos, Leidos, and the other has maintained the name SAIC. The main bulk of the corporation moved to Virginia, which is a good place for it, right next to Central Intelligence Agency.
Right.
And that's the current status of SAIC. By the way, just a footnote about SAIC: they had an office on Camp Pendleton, which I mentioned in the book. But also, when I was talking to Melinda Leslie about all of this, I mentioned before she claims to be an abductee and is a MyLab experiencer, meaning she's been abducted by military people after having her alien abductions.
Mm-hmm.
When I was telling her, I was having lunch with her and telling her this whole story, everything I'm telling you, before I said, there was a corporation in San Diego. That's as far as I got. And Melinda interrupts me and says, oh, SAIC? That's not something that most people know. Like, SAIC is not floating at the top of most people's consciousness on a daily basis. And she just busts out with, oh, SAIC. And I said, how did you know that? And she said, oh, well, in the investigations I've done with, she's spoken to dozens and dozens and dozens of MyLab experiencers, and a lot of them have some sort of odd connection to SAIC. So that's food for thought and grounds for further research.
Yeah. What do you think? And just because it's related and it keeps popping up with this thing in Cuba that seems like it could have been a sonic attack. Any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah. In fact, I have a blog, cryptoeschatology.com, and I keep sort of posting updates on that. Yes, that seems like a replay of situations that occurred back in the 1980s, where that technology was used on various people. It certainly seems like a reoccurrence. It seems like the same sort of technology that was being used on Damien. Who was using it and what was the purpose of it? I have no idea, but it certainly sounds like it's the same technology.
And that was going to be my next question. What would be the motivation behind something like that in Cuba? Who knows? It could be something as simple as what I've just said. If you're not cooperating and you have access to this technology, there's a lot of evil people out there, right? Yeah.
And if they have access to this technology, the way I describe it in the book to try to get it down on a mundane level that people can wrap their minds around it is, imagine you've just cut off Special Agent Lita Johnson on the freeway, and instead of going into road rage, she writes your license plate number down, and suddenly you're on, quote, the list. And now that sounds like a paranoid, the list. What do you mean? That sounds pretty paranoid. But actually, it's not really paranoid, because when you take into account the black budget, the ballooning black budget that occurred right after 9/11, you have a situation where all these intelligence agencies have been given all this money to prevent another 9/11. And so now you need to spend this money. And the way I bring this down to a prosaic level in the book is I explain that my first teaching job was I was an English tutor at El Camino Community College in Torrance. I had a tutoring job. And on the first day, I went into the room where I was supposed to teach or tutor whoever came in, and there were these math tutors sitting there. And they weren't doing anything. They were just like playing games, like flipping through their notebook, whatever. And after about like a half hour, I turned to them and I said, "What are we supposed to be doing? We're not doing anything." And they just laughed and said, "Oh no, you don't understand. Every year the English department here gets a certain amount of money and they have to spend it by the end of the year. And if they don't spend it, then they have to send the money back. Well, they don't want to do that. So they have to figure out a way to spend the money. So they hired you as an English tutor to have something to do with the money." Meanwhile, even though there were plenty of people there who could have used an English tutor, they didn't tell anyone that there was a tutor there. So I would just sit there and do my homework. Now, take that onto a vast, bigger level, and now you've got this black budget. You need to spend it on something. There's no one to watch because, in fact, the problem isn't really terrorism. So now we have to make up terrorists. And so now everyone's a terrorist.
Right.
So this guy in San Diego is not doing anything, pretty much just minding his own business. If he's abusing anyone, it's himself.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're going to say he's a terrorist, and we'll follow him around, and we'll create our little crypto Wikipedia page on him, and keep adding information about him into it, and then we can say that we're doing something. Meanwhile, the real terrorists you're walking in across the border of San Diego with a thermonuclear bomb strapped to their shoulders, and no one notices that.
Right.
That's why I really question the latest school shooter, who there were multiple, about 18 tips about this guy, people calling into the FBI saying this guy's about ready to explode, you should do something about it, them claiming they don't have enough manpower to do anything about it, which in fact is probably true, and I think that that's exactly how this situation started. You get someone like SAIC or Leidos, they approach the FBI and they say, you don't have enough manpower to watch all these potential terrorists. We do. Just contract it out to us. You can use the black budget money that you have, share it with us, and then you'll contract it out to us, and then we'll surveil these people and harass them, et cetera. And the FBI says, excellent idea. Here's the check. So now SAIC is doing this. The business is burgeoning, right? So then you got another, who knows, Infraguard, which is another one of these corporations. They approach Leidos and say, you know what, you don't have enough manpower to watch all these people, all these terrorists are wandering out here. You should contract it out to us. And then Leidos goes, that's a good idea. And then they sign the check over to Infraguard, and now they're doing it too. And then some other corporation, the Macy Group, MASY, they come along and they say to Infraguard, you don't have enough manpower to watch all these terrorists.
Right.
And they contracted out to them. There's just endless kinds of these, the DSAC, the Domestic Security Alliance Council, Whitney, Bradley and Brown, Infraguard, ITA International, Prescient Edge, EKS Group. It just goes on and on with these privatized industrial corporations who are doing this kind of thing. They're surveillance role players. That's used to be what they're called. They probably changed the name now. But essentially it's government-funded vigilantes. Which sounds like a paradox. How can you be government funded and be a vigilante? But that's a pretty good way of describing it.
Now there were also some experiences that Damien had on the beach.
Oh yes, I think you're the first person to mention this.
Because they're really weird experiences.
I think you're the first interview where anyone has ever brought this up. But he was on the beach. And he actually, there was a vehicle following him, and he could actually see the tracks in the beach following him, but there was no vehicle visible. And then, on top of that, he had another experience with, you're talking about the leapfrogging robots?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so he was on the beach, and he described them as these robots that moved in this kind of weird, jerky fashion, almost like a Ray Harryhausen stop-motion figure from like Jason the Argonauts from the 1960s.
Mhm.
Like, you know how that claymation is kind of like jerky and doesn't move in a kind of smooth human way. He called them leapfrogging robots. They were these odd mechanical creatures that were kind of leapfrogging on the beach, right there in Pacific Beach. And I included that detail because I took to heart something I read once in an interview with John A. Keel, who wrote a book called The Mothman Prophecies, which was later made into a film. And I read an interview with him once. And by the way, he had a similar kind of time lag. His experiences in Point Pleasant, West Virginia occurred in the late 60s, but he didn't write the book till 75.
Right.
And I read an interview with him where he said it was so disturbing he didn't want to think about it. And it took that long, about 8 years, to write it. And that's about the same time period that it took for me to process it and begin writing this book. What Keel said was that very often UFO researchers will leave out the most important detail of the case because it sounds silly or irrelevant or ridiculous. And that Keel discovered that usually those were the most important details.
Yeah,
and
the
so
high
he always made
strangeness.
the high strangeness details were the most important. So he always went out of his way to include them, which is why I didn't leave out the leapfrogging robots, which, by the way, they just had like a Spa War conference, where they show off their new technology.
Mhm.
And I was watching it, and sure enough, there are these robots that are moving in this weird, jerky fashion, and they're leapfrogging. And so, when they show you something, that means they've had it for many, many years.
Oh yeah, decades probably.
Yeah, and so the other weird detail that I insisted on including in the book, even though it might make the whole thing sound ridiculous, so I guess some people would say the whole thing does sound ridiculous. That one of Damien's friends who was also being harassed, who was named Adam, he talked about how he went into Santee, 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 California, which is right near San Diego, into this desert area, and there were these ape men. At first, they just saw these figures, dark figures, off in the distance in the desert, firing like machine guns. That's ominous just by itself. But there's a bunch of desert rats who go out there and just shoot. So it may not be that odd. The machine gun thing might be a little, worrisome. As they got closer, they saw the figures turn towards them, and they saw that they were hairy humanoid ape things on feet, walking on their feet, firing these guns. And they saw they were pretty close to them, and they could see their eyes, and so they turned around and got out of there real quick. And the reason I included that is because later on, I was talking to Melinda Leslie, and she had an experience where she and a bunch of people were all abducted at the same time in 2010 from Arizona. She was staying at a friend's house, and the military guys came in. They took Melinda. They took Melinda's friend. They took Melinda's friend's daughter, teenage or college-age daughter, and her friend's husband, and someone else. There was about 5 or 6 people they took all at the same time. And they took them to this underground base in the deserts there in Arizona. And the college-age daughter, at one point, she went off into another area of this facility, and she described a laboratory kind of setting where there were all these weird creatures that she described as like hybrids, like human/animal things, which I thought was interesting when she told me that, because I immediately thought of this story about the ape men. And then you may recall, since I know you've interviewed David Paulides many times, Paulides tells that story about the kids that were lost in the woods, and then the people came and found the kids hiding behind the bush, and then they asked the kids, "What are you doing? What, didn't you hear us calling you? We've been calling you for 12 hours. Why are you hiding here?" And then the kids said, "Well, we didn't want the ape men to come back. We thought you might be the ape men." So I decided to include that detail just because I thought it'd be a mistake to leave it out.
Sure.
And also, by the way, just briefly mentioning John Keel, there's an interesting connection. There's a website called John Keel, not an authority on anything. John Keel used to have a business card, and on the business card it would say not an authority on anything.
Yeah, I always love that.
If you go to the March 5th, 2014 post, it's called Organized Harassment of Individuals, and they list his notes. And it's just notes on and on about people being harassed back in the 60s. So I think, even though this thing ballooned after 9/11, 2001, I think it was going on even back then. And in fact, the first person who interviewed me about this book was Tessa Dick, the widow of Philip K. Dick. She has a radio show called Ancient of Days, and she interviewed me. And she told me that that she really liked the book because she could identify with it. Because when she was living with Philip K. Dick in Orange County in the 1970s, she said all the same stuff happened to Phil. And that specific incidents, like I describe in the book, how when Damien was living in that apartment on Garnett Avenue, his neighbors moved out one by one by one over the course of many months, and were all replaced with new neighbors. And all those neighbors were completely hostile to him. And Tessa Dick said the same thing happened to Phil Dick, and in fact, these new neighbors would move in, and they brought in this weird technology with antennas and stuff like that into the apartment. And then the radio started talking to Phil. But not just Phil, Tessa Dick heard it too. And the radio's not even plugged into the wall. And there's a voice coming through insulting Phil Dick, personally. And Tessa Dick heard this too, so it wasn't just like Phil was hallucinating. So again, that's in the 70s.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Wow, I did not know that. That's interesting. The invisible vehicle on the beach, and later you do get confirmation that this technology was available. You would think they would cover up the tracks though, unless they wanted him to see the tracks. You know what I mean?
That could have been it. I mean, it could have been part of the harassment. It could have been a ploy to just freak him out.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, obviously showing them the robots, again, would be something just to freak him out and make him think he's losing his mind.
Sure. Yeah, it often reminds me of not the movies of Mission Impossible, which I haven't seen, but back in the 70s, the Mission Impossible show, and the heroes were these intelligence agents who often, their job was to make someone go nuts.
Yeah,
and by the way, Phil Dick really loved the Mission Impossible TV series. But there was one particular episode where their job was to make some sort of dictator, like Fidel Castro, think he was going crazy. So the guy who was an expert in disguises would make everyone up to look like they were skulls or something, and then he would see a bunch of these people pass by, and he thought he was going crazy. And I asked later on. You wonder, sometimes these TV shows where they're getting their ideas from. I asked Richard Schonger later on, when me and Damien met him, I asked him, I said, with this technology, could you use this to make someone appear as if they were going crazy? And he said, oh yes, I included that in the patent. I included that as one of the uses of the technology, that not only could you use it to camouflage people, but you could also use it to make a tree look like it's a man or a dinosaur or a giant spider, whatever you can imagine, and that you could drive someone crazy for psychological warfare purposes. And of course, he was thinking of it as being used against enemies of the United States. He didn't think that they were going to use it against civilians.
Well, yeah, but it always is going to be.
Of course.
And
there's always going to be a scientist who's naive enough not to understand that.
Sure, because they're not thinking that way.
Yeah, of course.
And the government looks at everything as, how can we use this as a weapon?
Yes.
But what was the other thing I was going to ask you about that? How much do you think, obviously being a drug addict on top of everything else, Damien was probably prone to paranoia to begin with. How much of the things that happened to him do you think were there, like stuff they did then influencing his own paranoia?
You mean in other words, taking advantage of the paranoia that was already there?
Yeah, yeah.
Sure. Well, I mean, obviously, it's easier to push someone over the edge if they're already, if they already have paranoid tendencies. I mean, I don't think that Damien was particularly paranoid at the beginning of all this.
Oh, okay, okay.
He, as I said, his drug of choice was heroin, and I don't recall him having any really particular paranoid episodes until after all this started. I mean,
Right.
if you asked me, is he paranoid now? I would say, well, yeah, but that's sort of a natural reaction to having lived through all this, because you can't really ever know if you meet anyone new, someone new enters your life, you're wondering, is this just coincidence, or is this person been sent to mess with my head?
Yeah.
It would naturally drive you into kind of paranoid state.
I guess not only that though, but they're like with the people following him. I mean, there were obviously a good number of people following him, but I would think it was also possible that some of the people he like accosted may not have actually been following him.
Well, I mean, there's an incident I talk about in the book where this one guy was following him around, and he could tell. It was early on. It was early on enough that he wasn't even quite sure it was happening yet, and the guy was following him around, so he led him into some kind of a Salvation Army or something like that, and then the guy followed him out, and so Damien went into like a 7-Eleven and got a big Slurpee, and then in the middle of the street, the guy's like just a few feet behind him. Damien turns around and just splashes the entire Slurpee into the guy's face, and then calls him a homophobic word that would normally piss off any straight white male in the Marines.
Right.
And the guy didn't react at all. Didn't do anything. Just stared at him. Now, that in the real world, that doesn't happen. There would be some sort of reaction.
Absolutely.
And the guy didn't. He just acted like a robot. And probably because he was told, don't interact no matter what he does. Do not react. Those are your orders.
But I guess what I'm saying is there are probably a few of those people who really weren't following him, but maybe were startled by it, like he talks about pounding on the woman's car.
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely. Well, that only works to their advantage, doesn't it?
I mean, absolutely.
You can harass them to such an extent that maybe you can even pull everyone away for a while, and then the person's mind will do it to itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. That's a time-saving device right there, when you can get someone to do it to themselves.
What was the thing that finally convinced you that he wasn't just making this stuff up or wasn't just crazy?
Well, I mean, for the most part, when he sent me the license plate numbers, I mean, that was my initial. I thought, well, there's really no other explanation for this. However, when the story started getting more and more elaborate with the invisible people and the rooms growing and all that, I had to wonder how much of this is real and how much of it is not. So there was a room for doubt until Damien, he fled all the way to Winona, Kansas, which is a little town that has like 100 people in it. And for some reason, when he got there, the harassment stopped. I don't know if it's because it's such a small town that that you can't get away with a whole parade of jarheads following him down the street. I mean, you'd notice if suddenly a black van came down and there's all these new people coming into the town. Yeah. Also, everyone there owns guns. So as I said, this technology doesn't make you bulletproof. So they, for some reason, left him alone for about 3 months or so when he was in this town. He kind of was able to gather his wits together, and he went on the internet, and he was trying to find anything that looked like the invisibility technology that he had seen, and he saw something about a guy named Professor Tashi, who was this Japanese inventor who created this invisibility cloak, which wasn't quite what he had seen. And then he came upon this site called Chameleo.net. And it was this site run by this guy, Richard Schellingert. and Damien says, you should look at this website. This sounds like what I saw. So I'm looking at it, and I was surprised to see that Schoengert claims that he was a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemason at the Scottish Rite in Long Beach. Well, I'm a 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason at the Scottish Rite in Long Beach. So I thought, well, wait, this is weird. This guy is in the same lodge as me. I must have met him at some point, though I didn't know it. So I emailed him and I said, I'm a writer. I do interviews. I'd like to interview you about your technology project Chameleo. And he writes me back and says, sure. Well, and I mentioned to him that I'm in his lodge. And so he goes, oh, okay, well, we'll meet at the lodge, Saturday after next. And so I told Damien, I go, come down here. So Damien drives down, and we both pick up Richard, and we take him to lunch, and then we take him to my office on campus. And I didn't know if any of this was actually going to tie in to anything. I mean, it could have been just a dead end. But immediately, Richard starts talking about, first of all, I should mention that Richard has a top secret clearance, or did until recently. He recently retired. So he's worked on top secret projects, but Project Chameleo was his own individual private side project that was not funded by the military. And he starts telling me about all the uses, everything that you can do with this technology. You can use it for psychological warfare purposes. You can make rooms look like they're bigger than they actually are. You can make them look like they're smaller. You could project images outside a window. And on and on. He mentions that he was visited by employees of SAIC and that they came to visit him, and he showed them the technology 10 years earlier. He mentions that the Navy came to the laboratory that he shares with Dr. Lev Berger, who's a very eminent physicist, whose home base is in Hemet, California, which is the middle of nowhere. In fact, I went out to Lev Berger's laboratory. I went out there myself. And so the Navy went there to see what they could do, and they were interested in it. And Lev Berger and Richard thought, well, they're going to fund us. This was 10 years earlier, 10 years before the interview. And then after that, they kind of just went away. The Navy went away, SAIC went away. They seemed to lose interest. Then Richard busts out with the fact that he had initiated a lawsuit and FOIA requests against the Navy and the military and the Army because he thought that he had been stolen from.
Yeah.
And so at a certain point in the interview, I stop and I say, okay, Damien's got a story to tell you. And so Damien starts telling him the whole story. And at first, Richard looks a little like, what is this? What's going on here? But the point where Damien mentioned that he had seen the invisible person in the mirror as the mirror was in motion, he kind of leaned forward and he said, oh, yeah, that's what happens because they're cloaking the suit, but they're not cloaking the mirror. And then when Damien mentioned seeing the little auras in the air, the little dots, he just leans forward and Richard goes, that's exactly what it looks like when the technology is not working properly. And it was that moment I could tell Richard was totally invested in it, because there was no way that Damien would have known that. Damien's not a physicist. He doesn't know anything about optical camouflage.
Right.
It's not a detail that you would just make up. And Richard could tell that he was telling the truth. And also Richard had some... I interviewed Richard for a totally separate interview for Nexus Magazine last year. The whole point of that interview was just to go into the origins of Project Chameleo, like how he came up with the idea. And Richard said that his interest in Rosicrucianism, because he became a Rosicrucian in the 50s in Guam when he was in the military, he became a Freemason around the same time. So he said his interest in Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism kind of melded with, in the late 60s, he began to become interested in the UFO phenomenon. And as a Rosicrucian, he had heard for years stories about supposed ascended masters who had reached like the higher levels of Rosicrucianism who could make themselves invisible. And then he started going into the whole UFO thing and reading about how the UFOs had this cloaking technology. And he started to wonder, well, how would you do that with with our technology that we have today. And that's how it began. So in a way, I guess you could say that Richard's technology is kind of like the cargo cult version of the UFO technology. You know, you've probably seen movies from the 1930s, Tarzan movies, where there's an African tribe and they've built a plane out of wood and they're worshiping it. That's kind of like what has happened here. In other words, there's sort of like two phenomena happening at the same time. There's that technology which has been created by humans aping a real phenomenon. So you have two things going on at the same time.
And I want to kind of get more into that, but we are running out of time. Do you mind doing a second part?
Sure.
Okay, so let's stop there. And Robert, why don't you tell people where people can find your blog and where they can get the book, and then we're going to do a second part and cover the rest of all the things I want to talk about here.
Okay. I suggest going to orbooks.com, ORBOOKS.com, because on Amazon there are these crazy independent booksellers who are selling it for like over $1,000.
Oh, wow.
And that's nutty. You just go to orbooks.com. You can get it for $18. The ebook is like $10. So ORBOOKS.com. And my blog is cryptoschatology.com.
Spell that.
CRYPTOSCATOLOGY. Cryptoschatology, which is a word I made up. Crypto is Latin for secret, and scatology means the study of feces. So it's the study of secret feces.
Gotcha. Nice. All right, so we will continue this with part 2. And a special thanks to our Patreons who are donating at the $10 or above level. Christopher Sheehan, Mark Brady, Allison Cook, Christopher Vaughn, Robert Groom, Chris Elmquist, Super Inframan, Patricia Giaquinta, Lauren Melton, John Eddy, Alfred Tuttle, Kevin Schreck, and Carla Mahoney. Thank you all so very much. All right, next week, part 2 of my conversation with Robert. Patreons will get it very, very soon this week. And as I said, I think I'm going to put together a little extra segment out of the conversation we had afterwards for Patreons as well. So again, the book is Chameleo, a strange but true story of invisible spies, heroin addiction, and homeland security. And you can get it at OR Books, O-R Books. Don't get it on Amazon because you'll get ripped off unless you're listening to this months from now, because they will get it back on Amazon eventually. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.